Welcome, everyone. My name is Lee Fisher. I'm the Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University, and welcome to this very exciting webinar. I should tell you, I was talking to a Zoom expert the other day, and I was asking, how do you gauge whether a Zoom webinar has good attendance? And that person told me that the national standard is if you can get over 30 people, you've got a successful webinar. I want you to know that we are approaching 120 right now, so this is already a spectacular success. So thank you all for being here today. I want to give you a little background. Today's panel discussion is called Facing and Confronting Our History. I want to give you some background as to why we're doing this. Our law school, Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State, is undergoing a process to determine whether we should remove any reference to the fourth Chief Justice of the United States, Chief Justice John Marshall, in our law school's name because of Justice Marshall's association with slavery. Now, obviously, removing Marshall from our law school's name would be a very consequential decision by the College of Law and the university, and it requires careful study and thoughtful consideration of different viewpoints from our entire law school and our university community. And in considering a name change, we're going to be incorporating wide input. As part of that process, we're holding some virtual public forums, and this is the first of those forums, to provide some context for our fact-finding and our decision-making process. Now, we're not asking our speakers today to weigh in on whether we should change our name, unless, of course, they want to. They certainly can. But we're asking them to speak about the complex legacy of institutions like ours and what happens then. In other words, how do you face, confront, and reckon with your history? To introduce our first speaker, I'm going to ask Professor Reggie O to introduce Professor Jackie Jones.
Okay, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Jacqueline Jones, who is the president of the American Historical Association and the LNC Temple Professor of Women's History and Maston Gentry White Professor of Southern History at the University of Texas at Austin, where she teaches courses in American history. Before coming to University of Texas, she taught at Wellesley College, Brown University, and Brandeis University. Like I said, she's the president of the American Historical Association, and she was a MacArthur Fellow from 1999 to 2004. If you don't know much about the MacArthur Fellow, they call it the Genius Grant. So you can get a sense of what it means to be a MacArthur Fellow. She's the author of numerous books. One of her recent books is Dreadful Deceit, The Myth of Race from Colonial Era to Obama's America. And one of her early books, but I think it's one of her seminal books, is her book called Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family from Slavery to the Present, published in 1985, and it won the Bancroft Prize in American History, I think handed out by Columbia University. And just a little anecdote, Professor Jones and I go way, way, way back. When I learned about the book, I was in law school at Boston College Law School, and in my third year, I was chair of the Diversity Month Committee, and I invited Professor Jones to speak on a panel on welfare reform, which is one of the big issues at that time. And I wanted her to provide some historical context to the policy debates. And the other two panelists were state legislatures. And I remember this distinctly. After Professor Jones went first and spoke, then she finished, then one of the legislators who was speaking next said this: "I thought we were here to talk about welfare reform, not about history." And I was like, well, the whole point of bringing Professor Jones was to talk about history and to talk about how history is relevant to virtually all the policy issues this nation faces today. And of course, it's centrally important to the question we are dealing with today about how we confront and face this nation's complex legacy with respect to race and justice. And I can't really, other than Garrett Epps, I can't think of another historian to provide historical context to this issue than Professor Jones.
And before we ask Professor Jones to speak, we're going to introduce our other two speakers as well. And to introduce Professor Ashley Woodson, I've asked Terry Billups, a member of our alumni board and a member of the law school name committee, to introduce Professor Woodson. Terry?
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Professor Ashley N. Woodson. Professor Woodson is a sociologist of education and advocate for reparative learning opportunities in Black communities. She earned both her PhD in curriculum and instruction and her master's in African and African American studies from Michigan State University. Professor Woodson was recently appointed the Assistant Director of the National Center of Institutional Diversity at the University of Michigan. Prior to her appointment, she served in the Center for Urban Education at University of Pittsburgh and the Carter Center for K-12 Black History Education at the University of Missouri. Professor Woodson's awards include the American Educational Research Association's Early Career Award in Social Studies and the National Council of Social Studies Kirkland Social Justice Award. Her activism, research, and teaching center on the civic aspirations of Black children. She is co-editor of the volume, The Future is Black, Afro-Pessimism, Fugitivity, and Radical Hope in Education, with co-editors Carl A. Grant and Michael Dumas. She is currently completing a book on Black mourning and commemoration in urban Michigan. So join me in welcoming Professor Ashley Woodson, and I thank her very much for joining us today in this discussion.
Thank you, Terry. And now for our third speaker, back to Professor Reggie O.
Yeah, and I also have the pleasure to introduce Professor Garrett Epps, who is Legal Affairs Editor of the Washington Monthly. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Baltimore School of Law, I think just this past year, right? Or, yeah. And he's taught, he's a constitutional law scholar, legal historian who's taught at American University, Boston College Law School, Duke, and the University of Oregon. His books include Democracy Reborn, the 14th Amendment, and the Fight for Civil Rights in Post-Civil War America, and American Epic, Reading the U.S. Constitution. And Professor Garrett Epps and I also go way back, not quite as far back as with Professor Jones, but we go back. He's been a friend and a mentor when I first started out in legal academia. Absolutely brilliant legal historian, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that he's written what I consider one of the most influential law review articles that I've ever read, and it was the basis for his book. The article is The Antebellum Political Background of the 14th Amendment, published in the Law and Contemporary Problems Journal. And in that article, he does a really a brilliant historical analysis, contending that the Civil War and the 14th Amendment were not just responses to slavery, but were responses to the specific threat of the slave power, what he calls the slave power. And I highly encourage you to read this article, because once you read this article, you will never understand the issues of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction in the same way. Again, I assign his article every year. I teach constitutional law, and I swear, literally it blows students' minds, I think, learning about what he writes about the slave power in that article. So again, honored to have Professor Garrett Epps on this panel.
Thank you, Professor O. And to all of you watching, we're now over 120 people tuning in. That's wonderful. Please feel free to use your Q&A function to ask questions throughout the talks, and we'll get to many of those questions as we can. And now it's my privilege to ask our first speaker. Each one will talk for about 10 to 12 minutes to speak, and that's the president of the American Historical Association, Professor Jacqueline Jones.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Professor Fisher. Thank you, Professor O, for that very nice introduction. So I just want to stress at the beginning that the American Historical Association, with one exception, doesn't really weigh in on the substance of renaming decisions, but we do have very defined procedures in mind. That is, we have identified a particular process that we think that institutions should follow if they are considering renaming or taking down statues or other monuments. So what is the one exception? That exception is that the AHA does recommend that cities, towns, school districts, universities revisit their Confederate monuments and consider removing them. These are monuments to men who advocated taking up arms against the US government, supported the destruction of the US government in order to preserve the institution of human bondage. So in that sense, the HA does have a stand, and you can read more about it. I sent to Professor O some links that he can share with participants, with attendees here this afternoon. And one of those links is the AHA statement on Confederate monuments. But beyond that, we really do defer to locales in terms of their decisions about who they want to honor. And that is the central issue here. Who is it from the past or the present that a community wishes to honor? So along those lines, we look at a variety of strategies that we think are good ones. One of those is to involve as many members of a community as possible, as many constituents who would have an interest in this decision, who live nearby, who are somehow associated with the institution for whatever reason. In other words, a wide range of voices needs to be brought into the conversation. Secondly, we think that any process should be transparent. Those who have a stake in the decision should know how it's being decided, who is participating, who is influential, who isn't. That transparency is essential. And just a reminder that when the Confederate monuments went up in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was not a range of voices. This was a neo-Confederate decision among a few white people. And the decision-making was hardly transparent. It was conducted mostly within private organizations devoted to promoting this idea of the lost cause, the Confederacy as a lost cause. Also, third, we think that any group that is serious about the renaming process should consult and involve professional historians. It's really essential that this process take into consideration the history of the period in which a building was named, a university was named, in which a monument went up. What was the purpose? What was the context? Why was this person being honored at the time? Who was involved in making that decision? Professional historians are I think, crucial to this process. And here I would offer a cautionary tale in the form of the recent activities of the San Francisco Board of Education, school board. They chose a very small committee, did not involve the community, and for their research, they relied on Wikipedia articles. And they came up with some very misleading information and made their decision not on the basis of historical accuracy or scholarship, but on what they found online. And that was really not a good way to go about things. And finally, we urge these committees or forums or bodies who are making these decisions to consider a person's wide range of activities. And that's up to, again, the deciders here. But I would just say there are very few saints in history. If you're looking for someone without any blemishes at all, that's going to be a very problematic enterprise, it seems to me. So the body, I think, should sit down, talk among themselves. What are our values? What was this person perhaps best known for? What are other parts of this person's life that make us pause and reconsider the original effort to honor him? So those are some considerations. And again, you might check out the HA statements first on not only the Confederate monuments, but secondly, on the San Francisco School Board's effort, recently abandoned, I believe, to change the names of 44 public schools there in the city. It was a very problematic process. The HA made a statement about it, lamenting their very principled stance that they did not want to consult professional historians. And that was a problem. And then the third link that I forwarded to Professor O is one that is a letter to the New Orleans City Council praising that body for the way they have gone about in renaming their streets. And it's a really great process. It's a model of its kind. So I won't go into the details here, but I will say that it met all the criteria that we established. It was a transparent process, brought in a lot of different voices in the city of New Orleans. It involved professional historians, and it also involved kind of a thoughtful reckoning of how and why certain individuals should or should not be honored. So just two more points, and then I'll yield. But I did want to say, first of all, that confronting history does not mean erasing history. I've heard too often people say, well, if we take down a monument or if we change a name, we're trying to deny a part of our history that ever happened. We're trying to erase that history. I would say to the contrary. Look at this webinar and look at other efforts related to considerations of renaming. They encourage people to confront history, to grapple with it, to come to terms with it. And that's a great process. And that's the opposite, really, of erasing history. So my last anecdote here is that on July 9th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud in the city of New York for the very first time. And a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty ran down to what was called Bowling Green in the city of New York, and they proceeded to pull down a monument to King George III. Now, that we wouldn't expect them to do anything else, it seems to me. The king was no longer the man of honor, the authority that he was when that statue was erected. And the Sons of Liberty hope to start a new era in the country's history by removing that statue. So it's just a reminder that each generation revisits its own history, revisits the past, not to erase it, but to understand it and to confront it. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jones. That was outstanding. And I'm very pleased now to introduce Professor Ashley Woodson, our second speaker. Professor Woodson.
All right, thank you, Lee. And it's wonderful to be here with y'all. Actually, I'm at my house. It would be wonderful to be there with y'all. My soror, Marcia Fudge, is an alumna. And of course, it's very exciting to me to have any connection to any hallowed grounds on which she stood. I'm such a fan. So I'm going to talk a bit about, I'm not going to repeat much of what Dr. Jones shared. My activism regarding the Stephen Foster Memorial in Pittsburgh, Thomas Jefferson Memorials in Missouri, memorials throughout Montgomery, Alabama, and other places were deeply informed by the American Historical Association's expectations. So it would be a bit repetitive to go through some of those experiences, though I'm more than willing to answer questions about them during the question and answer session. Instead, what I'm going to attempt to do by reading a little bit from the introduction for my forthcoming book and just sharing thoughts from my research more broadly is to bring the stories of Black children and Black families from those geographic regions and the concepts that have undergirded their cause for recognition and dignity to the forefront of your continued conversation. Now, I'm from Toledo, Ohio, and one of the most underappreciated gifts that Toledo gave the world besides me is singer and gospel royalty Shirley Murdoch, who is often associated with her 1986 hit As We Lay. And I was singing that song when I was very, very young. Labor of Love, Dr. Jones, came out the year before I was born. So then a song coming out in 1986, I was way too young to be singing that song. And I didn't know what she was saying, just like I didn't know what Stevie Wonder was saying in Part-Time Lover, and I didn't know what Whitney Houston was saying in Saving All My Love for You, or what TLC was singing in Creep. All those songs are about affairs, actually. And as a child, I didn't have sufficient context to make sense of these songs, so I didn't recognize that they commemorated a complicated, difficult, and often painful experience. As I grew older, there were times when playing these songs became really, really uncomfortable. Suddenly watching sunlight stream across somebody else's husband's face became a lyric with consequence. Shirley Murdoch's vocals couldn't distract me from the missing perspective in As We Lay, as I watched friends cope with their partner's infidelity. My familiarity with betrayal, vulnerability, and selfishness brought new significance to these songs, and I began to feel the complication, difficulty, and pain of each performance in a new way. My knowledge of and sense of connection to this particular representation of life, to this particular representation of love, greatly influences how I feel about As We Lay in any given moment. My naive happiness every time the song played when I was a child matured into a sobered, though harmonic reflection on the fragility of intimate relationships. I've learned that I can never assume that my interpretation of any performance is the only or most legitimate interpretation. And I must remember that my interpretation might change as I grow over time. So you probably see where I'm going here. Confronting the totality of our complicated, difficult histories and our painful realities requires shared context and referential empathy. It requires new experiences, new consciousness, and new languages. This is true for my interpretation of the affair in the Shirley Murdoch song, and for my interpretations of monuments and memorials throughout our country that have come under increasing scrutiny. So I find it easier to start here with this example than with any given headline about the removal of a monument or a name change, or the fight over a street name. Most of us have experienced some form of anxiety, loss, or betrayal around an interpersonal relationship, romantic or otherwise. And if you've ever thrown away a picture, blocked a number, ripped up a letter, set something on fire like Angela Bassett and Waiting to Exhale, then you know what it means to want control over the politics of remembrance. Now, the politics of remembrance are the rules we rely on when making choices about how we're going to tell the story of us. It's how we decide what's important enough for a postage stamp, a statue, a street name, or a national holiday. A few years ago, the New York Times launched a debate about the politics of remembrance, advocating that we consider the year 1619, the year the first enslaved Africans arrived on the shores of what will become Virginia, as important, if not as important, if not more important than the year 1776, the meeting of the Second Continental Congress that transitioned the colonies to the United States of America. Another example, in 2020, that's the first year that the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma is represented on Google Maps since the web mapping service began in 2005. The Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma knew where it was all along. But even in 2020, Supreme Court justices were still debating exactly what authority the 5 tribes had over their land and how that authority might be codified into law. What are our most cherished principles? When is our founding? When does the story of us actually begin? How do we debate boundaries, sovereignty, and belonging? How we answer these questions is an extension of the politics we use to remember, and of course, the politics we use to forget. This is one way to think about what we prioritize when we tell stories about our relationships and what we might leave out. We have inherited social networks, histories, affinities, and traumas. Without question, we are individuals who make individual interpretive decisions, but there are ideological big bangs, categories of gender, race, class, religion that we did not create, that we did not ask for, and that still shape how we perceive ourselves and others, that shape our familiarity and placement within certain narratives, and that shape our interpretation of symbols. I don't think there will ever be universal answers to these questions or a rule for every memorial in every context, but there are 2 concepts that I'd like to add to Dr. Jones' thoughts that have shaped my thinking as I support communities and future teachers in understanding the goals of social studies education broadly, mnemonic restitution, and memory justice. Mnemonic restitution is the idea that we should actively work to ensure that all people who are part of the United States story are treated with equal regard as we commemorate the past. In her book, Sites of Slavery, Tillett distinguishes between various forms of belonging in the United States, including legal citizenship, the right to vote, economic access, the right to earn, and civic membership, the right to recognition. While all are necessary for participation in democracy, that last one, civic membership, is harder to legislate and goes back to the concepts I raised earlier, concepts of shared context and referential empathy. In the context of public life, mnemonic restitution has been summarized as the idea that we all deserve opportunities to see our historical counterparts and have others see them as credible, competent, and necessary to the development of our society. If worth is determined in any way by memorialization, then an accessible memorial landscape should be reflective of our diverse human dignity. The second idea is memory justice. Memory justice is how we leave our mark in civic spaces where we've been ignored or erased. Mnemonic restitution demands that we rectify past and present exclusions based on principles of equity. Memory justice demands that we work together to acknowledge and repair the pain that past and present exclusions have caused. Again, memory justice can't be legislated. It's a principle that undergirds sincere democratic dialogue with one another about the damage done by past commemorative decisions and how we hold ourselves accountable moving forward. In 2027, the FBI files on MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., will supposedly be released. I'm going to learn a lot that I probably did not want to learn. And we will all likely become engulfed in memorial controversies anew. So in the last few years, the King is reasonably safe. I'd like to quote him, particularly the idea that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. It is a slow arc, maybe even slower than he foresaw. Let's say we look at history and acknowledge that at every point along the arc, there were voices that various forms of structural and ideological violence wrote off as savage, incomprehensible, or inconvenient. Dr. King was complicit in that process at times. We all have been, but each generation, either through moral advancement or through force, has to conceive of justice and reparation with a broader understanding of what injustice has been, what it is, and what it could be. We know better, and we should do better. Ideas like mnemonic restitution and memory justice push us toward better. They don't give us easy answers, but it's not a reason to despair. It's motivation to repair. Taken together, mnemonic restitution and memory justice mean that sometimes, in order for something new to be seen, something else might have to get out of the way. And as we bend toward whatever justice might be, answers to tough questions should probably err on the side of the oppressed, because we've never erred on their side before. That doesn't delegitimate the relationships to the United States of those who have historically held power. It puts those relationships in context, and it supports the evolution of our understanding of where we've been. That's all, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Woodson. It was excellent. And now I want to introduce our third speaker, Professor Garrett Epps. Professor, go ahead.
Thanks, Dean. I have to say, it's a great honor for me to be on a panel, any panel dealing with historical figures and with someone as eminent as Professor Jones. I myself write a lot about history. I'm not formally a historian, but the good news is I have reached the stage of life where I myself am history. I am my own primary source, and I will draw on that because in this context, I think I had a kind of uniquely powerful encounter with these issues from my upbringing. I grew up literally one block from the Lee Monument that has been the center of a great deal of dispute in the city of Richmond on Monument Avenue, which is really probably the world center of neo-Confederate imagery during the time I grew up in Richmond. And I attended a private segregated school whose entire organization, from the school colors to the way that competitions were carried out among students and so forth, were based on the Army of Northern Virginia, the school colors, the names of the teams and so forth. And so I was forced to do a lot of thinking about these issues even before enough change occurred in the South to give us some real tools for analyzing this kind of issue. And the central problem that I had growing up was, how is it possible to live in a society dominated by these images? You know, literally growing up of only a few blocks from statues of Lee, Jackson, Jeb Stuart, Jefferson Davis, some guy named Matthew Fontaine Maury, who I never understood, but you take the point. What questions do you ask yourself? How do you grow up in that environment and retain this idea that people different from you are also human beings worthy of respect, who also human beings of equal rights? And I think the genius of neo-Confederate imagery was that it really is not possible to do both. The cognitive dissonance is too great. But that gives us some questions we can ask ourselves as we confront symbolism issues in a wide variety of contexts, because not every place is Richmond, not every street is Monument Avenue. And my thoughts about this that are the questions that one would ask oneself facing one of these issues. And the first is, drawing on my own experiences, remember, these are not the historical figures themselves, right? We're not talking about erasing history. These are symbols of historical figures and should be analyzed in sort of symbolic terms. What do they symbolize? Are they part of a system of symbols, as was certainly the case in Richmond, where the entire civic symbolism was devoted to the lost cause and the neo-Confederate narrative of the Noble South. What's the history of that? Where does it come from? What does it communicate to people in the sense that, part of that is what's left out. And one of the points I have made to people in the debate over this is that if you just look literally at that one avenue, Monument Avenue, one of the most famous civic avenues in the country that is totally dominated by, or has been totally dominated by, Confederate symbolism, that same street was the site of some fairly amazing events in the history of the Black struggle for freedom and civil rights in the Civil War, including a speech to freed slave people by Abraham Lincoln, including the liberation of the Virginia state capitol by Black soldiers of the Army of the Potomac. None of those things are commemorated on that street. So what is left out becomes really important. And then the final question is to notice is how much of, for us as lawyers, is how much of this debate really is shaped and sometimes stopped by law, that these monuments make history into property that belongs to someone and in whom people have certain rights. And in the case of the Lee statue, which has now been, the Commonwealth of Virginia has been given permission to remove the Lee statue at last, though that order is still under appeal. But if you look back, the Lee statue was not purely an act of civic commemoration. Right? And Professor Jones talked to some extent about this, where these things come from. Are they made in decisions to memorialize certain things? Are they made transparently and so forth? This was a gift of a family member or a group of family members to the city that was given under certain conditions, accepted by the all-white city government and so forth. And a century later, when it came time to take it down, a member of that same family brought a lawsuit in circuit court in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and was awarded standing by the judge on the grounds that his family had owned the land for the statue and that it hurt their feelings to have this statue removed. And which raises the point, why is that person's feelings some kind of legal prerogative, whereas the feelings and the psychic injury that is inflicted on dozens of people who have to pass through this shrine to the Confederacy has no legal existence. And I think as lawyers, we want to look really closely at that and try to think out. I remember Ashley was talking about mnemonic justice. We want to talk about that concept in ways that lawyers are not often comfortable doing. The last thing I want to say is that, you know, we look at each of these situations as unique. Each has a different context. Each has a different history. It's very important not to think of these as parochial or sectional concerns. You know, I now live in Oregon, which is pretty darn far away from Richmond, Virginia. And I live in Lane County, where a lively debate is going on about the fact that Joseph Lane was the vice president on the John C. Breckinridge States Rights Party ticket in the 1860 election on a pro-slavery platform. So these commemorative issues are very important nationally and need to be discussed in a sort of undefensive way. And I'm very honored to be part of this very forward-looking discussion that you're having at Cleveland Marshall. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Professor Epps. I want to remind all of you, all 130 of you, that you should use the Q&A function on your computer to ask questions, and we'll be monitoring that and try to get you your question at some point before the end of our discussion today. I'm going to be asking the first question, and not surprisingly, we have already heard from a wide number of people who have wide range of views about whether we should be doing this. Some even think we shouldn't even be considering it. And those who do think we should consider it believe that we should not change our name, or for that matter, most institutions should not change their name. And the words that are often used are cancel culture, political correctness, as Professor Jones said, erasing history, slippery slope. And that's particularly true, I think, in many people's minds as it pertains to our founding fathers, like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, or in our case, Chief Justice Marshall. So how do you react to the fact that it's not, even if it's not erasing history, it's part of a cancel culture, it's part of a slippery slope, and where do you draw the line? Who wants to go first? Nobody. So I'll go back to Professor Jones to start.
Yeah, okay. Well, as I said, I don't see that we're erasing or canceling anything by confronting these very difficult questions and wrestling with them. So, you know, and I neglected to say at the outset, and I should say it here, that in some cases, institutions just want a new name on something. So I think what happened with the San Francisco School Board was they really just wanted to rename anew. And they went through a kind of charade of looking at the biographies of people who had schools named after them: Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, James Russell Lowell, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., the list went on. They kept the Malcolm X and the Martin Luther King Jr. names, by the way, but you know, I think they should have been honest with themselves that they had ideas for new names. And they were eager, I think, to install those new names. And it was not necessary for them to come up with reasons to get rid of the old names. So all this is to say is, if everybody has, you know, a better name for the John Marshall School of Law, then maybe, you know, you should go that direction and not think about it. There would have to be a consensus, obviously. But as far as the slippery slope goes, I think, again, anybody that's making this decision has to set out guidelines for itself. And those guidelines might say, look, you have to take the totality of the person's history into account. You have to come to grips with what that person was honored for at the beginning. Do we still honor that person for that reason? Or are there other aspects of that person's life that we feel now override those initial efforts to honor that person? But it is a way, you know, to honor someone and to express community values. That's what naming is all about. So I wouldn't worry about the slippery slope if the group making the decision is very clear among itself what it prioritizes.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
I think I agree with everything Dr. Jones shared, but I also wonder the fear against cancel culture or the notion that we would be erasing history. I find it unlikely that we're going to eradicate the names of the founding fathers from textbooks. I find it unlikely that our money is going to change anytime soon. And in many ways, the lesson that we're teaching is you can participate in the greatest known atrocity of a particular historical period and have your name chiseled in stone on some of the most prominent buildings in our institutions of higher learning, our religious institutions. And I think that for me, and for a lot of the communities that I've worked with, is a greater fear than this notion that slave-holding white men, who this conversation often centers around, would somehow be forgotten, or their contributions to society, their contributions to democracy, the things that we should take away from their writings, their histories, their legacies, would somehow be forgotten because we remove statues that were very often constructed, designed, and put up long after their lives to serve different types of purposes. So the history in question is not the history of the 16, 17, or 1800s. You know, the history in question is very often the history of the 1920s, right? Or the history of the 1940s, and the reasons why these names were chosen, or these statues were erected, or these streets were named in that way in those particular moments, at those particular times. That's the history that we sometimes tend to overlook in our rush to defend the limitations or problematic nature of some of our national heroes.
Thank you. Professor Epps?
Yeah, I want to say one thing, which is I think that the term, whoever coined the term cancel culture is kind of a genius of propaganda, because it suggests that a very normal social historical process of re-examining history has become some sort of nefarious, sort of Orwellian process. And I think we don't need to worry about cancel culture for a while yet. If you are from, for example, the southeastern United States, the idea that somehow we're going to erase the history of the Civil War is just laughable, because it's literally written into the geography, and it is preserved, quite beautifully in battlefield monuments and the Civil War Center in Richmond, Virginia, and so forth, that put these things into context. And the fact that we may change some of the more garish monuments, the fact that Stone Mountain might not be considered a great work of art anymore, it doesn't strike me that anyone is being canceled. Symbols are being changed. The actual contributions of the, or lack thereof, of the individuals remain. I do think that it is worth asking ourselves, it is certainly historically the case in other situations where we see movements of symbolic purification become excessive. It certainly happened in revolutionary France, for example, or in China and so forth. We're not even close to that, because what we're really arguing about is whether there should be any representation at all of the people of the currents of history that object to this one monochromatic, and by monochromatic I mean white, view of the origins of the United States. We're quite a ways away from cancel culture at this moment, it seems to me.
Thank you. Let's go to Professor O for a question.
Okay, just one point about, there's a couple questions in the Q&A about the question asked is, why was this law school named after Chief Justice John Marshall? And that is an excellent question. And that's one we've brought up during the meetings we had with regards to the name committee. And the answer is, we don't know. We looked at the history and we could not find out why the school is named after John Marshall. And does that matter? So I have another question, but you just for the speakers, does that matter that the we don't even know why the school is named for the person it's named after. And if that's the case, what is the big deal in changing it if we don't really know why we're honoring John Marshall in the first place? Okay, and then here's my broader question to all of you, and this comes from from the links that Professor Jones sent about guidelines for assessing, trying to make this decision, change the name or not, and it's about honoring or stopping honoring, to stop honoring someone. And it depends, it's a weighing of the great qualities of a person. This is from Eric Foner, considered in relation to the flaws of that person or people, great or small. Okay, that's what struck me, the great or small part in terms of flaws. How do you assess whether the flaws of a person or group of people are great or small? And here's the way I think about this, which is with John Marshall, one of the reasons that we think that his name should be removed from the law school is because of his direct association with slavery. He was a slave owner, okay? But to what extent do the framers who did not own slaves get off the hook, okay? The fact that all of the framers decided together to agree to a nation based on slavery. Are those flaws for those framers who did not personally own slaves, but who agreed to this country with slavery, with a country in which slavery would exist, are their flaws smaller than someone like John Marshall who actually personally owned slaves, or are their flaws as equally the same in terms of magnitude, in terms of how great or how small? To what extent, I guess I think about responsibility and accountability. Who's responsible and accountable for this grave system of injustice that occurred, that took place as part of this nation for a long period of time? And is it just those specific slave owners that get the blame, or is it even people who oppose slavery but decided to say, well, but we acquiesce and agree to let slavery exist and in order to build the nation? So of those framers, right? So great or small, their flaws, even if they did not own slaves personally. Anyone first want to take a stab? Ashley?
Oh, sure. I saw Dr. Jones' mic go off, so I wanted to, okay.
Go ahead, I defer to you.
All right. So I never met Thomas Jefferson. I never spoke with the man, but I have met dozens, if not in the early hundreds, of Black women who attended the University of Missouri, Columbia, who were uncomfortable walking by his statue every day. And for me, it's not a conversation about blame. It's not even a conversation about accountability. It's a conversation of tending to the aspirations of the living over the dead, and reframing our civic landscape in a way that honors our diverse pathways to democratic recognition. So I'm not going to create tally sheets where I'm going to, well, this was your proximity to, the institution of chattel slavery, and thus you can have a monument, but it can only be 5 feet high. Like, I'm not going to get into that type of algorithm, right? I think when we are confronted with movements that by and large, regardless of where we stand on a particular notion of reparations, we all understand that harm was inflicted, intergenerational harm was inflicted, and that there are cultural traumas, vicarious traumas, and various forms of structural harm that continue to be enacted because of the institution of slavery. And this is not to exclude conversations for Indigenous folks, Latina and Latino folks, right? For Asian folks and other immigrant groups whose racial ethnic identities rerouted their ability for dignity and their access to dignity in this country. But because we're talking about slavery and slave ownership and the ways in which that dilemma is often framed in Black and white, I will censor my comments on the Black communities that I've worked with. I find it difficult as a Black woman to live in a country where the possible sentiments or good deeds of white men who have been dead for centuries override the hopes of the Black women students that I worked with to increase their sense of psychological safety and possibly actual safety when we think about how these symbols work out and end up in situations of violence on the campus that they pay to attend. So I try to have the conversation a little bit differently. It's not about protection. It's not about veneration of those who are dead or not. It's not about blaming them or not. It's thinking about how we want our society to look and how we want folks to feel like they belong or not in particular social and civic spaces.
I did just want to amplify what Ashley has just said. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not necessarily an issue that affects people of color only. When I first stepped foot on the University of Texas campus, I was astounded to see a statue of Jefferson Davis having pride of place at the top of the South Mall, along with Robert E. Lee and Albert Sidney Johnson. I mean, I was offended. I was shocked as an American citizen that people who had committed treason, taken up arms against the United States were given this place of honor on the campus. And I must say that although I've talked about the need for historical research and scholarship, that at times these are visceral responses. I mean, Ashley has spoken very eloquently of, emotion is a key part of this. And I can just say that my reaction that day, I knew who Jefferson Davis was and what he had done, but I had a visceral reaction. I was just so appalled by the sight of him. It was an offense. I was offended deeply as a citizen. So I think that has to be part of the equation too. And obviously it's good to consider lots of different factors, but how we honor people, what they have stood for, what we think they stand for today, these are complicated issues, but emotional reactions are certainly part of the mix here. Yes. And Garrett has spoken about that in terms of, Monument Row in Richmond. I think it's a similar kind of thing.
I think what's I don't have any epigrammatic answers here, but I have seen this play out in two different ways, because I remember we're not dealing with the people, we're dealing with symbols of the people. Jefferson Davis in Texas is not Jefferson Davis. He probably never got there, but he is a symbol of Jefferson Davis. Why is he here? And the difference in symbols and context and intention and the people who put them there, to me, is illustrated by this fable that I lived through that I can't really tell you the moral of, but I told you about growing up next to all the Confederate monuments. Those monuments were put in place not by General Lee himself, he was long gone. They were put in place by people who were basically celebrating the triumph of the segregated system after Reconstruction, who were basically sending the message that white people are back in charge. We are silencing those who are different from the way we are, and that it had that effect, and it had that intent, and it had that context. When I lived in Washington until very recently, I lived 2 blocks from the famous Statue of Emancipation in Lincoln Park, which I know Professor Jones is familiar with, which is a statue that was built by donations from newly freed enslaved people, mostly in Missouri, who gave small amounts of money. It was commissioned as a tribute to Lincoln by the former slaves who felt that he had played a part in their liberation. It, on the other hand, it depicts that act of liberation in a way that people find very distressing, because it emphasizes the kind of submission of the African-American figure depicted in Lincoln in a sort of godly rise tone. On the other hand, it was dedicated in a ceremony attended by Ulysses Grant and at which Frederick Douglass was the leading speaker. It means a great deal to a large number of people of different persuasions and different backgrounds. And that's a very tough thing. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's not hard to figure out what to do with Monument Avenue, which they've done now. Take those damn things, those eyesores down, get them out of my sky. When you move to a place where the context is different, it's a lot harder to try to figure out what should be done, let's say with an emancipation statue or a statue of George Washington in a given circumstance.
Thank you.
As I
Let's
say,
go to
I don't
Terry
think there's no
Billups.
answer, but yeah.
Yes. Let's go to Terry Billups for a question.
All right, thank you. Professor Woodson, can you, before I get into the question, there was a question here that somebody wanted to know if you have a title yet for your upcoming book that you're working on, and is there a release date?
Before COVID, you're already supposed to have it in your hands. But at this point, it's early 2022, Resurrections, Black Women's Public Mourning, and the Urgency of Eternity is the name. And I'm going to keep working on it through as the world goes back to something like normal, and hopefully you'll have it in early 2022.
Okay, well, thank you for providing that information. So here's the question I want to ask to you, and then obviously for each of the other panelists to sort of weigh in and give their thoughts about it as well. There was an article that you were heavily cited in the Atlantic, and the title of the article was what it's like to attend a school named after Confederate general. And there's a section of the article where you talk about the sort of the psychological effects that institutions that have names after Confederate generals or other figures such as a slave holder, what type of effect that has on the Black and minority students who attend those institutions. And one of the places where you're quoted at, it says, according to Professor Woodson, these cases show how youth in predominantly Black schools are reclaiming their sense of belonging when they are challenging the naming of institutions and things of the nature. And you stated, my research suggests that racist symbols is a detriment to the wholeness and development of young people as civic agents. Discarding Confederate names might be purely symbolic, but even in these symbolic victories, being able to remove a reminder of the explicit and legally supported subordination of your community is very powerful. Can you sort of expand upon that and help us understand what you meant by that? And we do hear people all the time that say, well, there's much larger issues to fight. There's much larger battles that we need to wage in. And how you feel like something of this nature compares to some of the larger civil rights issues that we need to face.
Oh, for sure. So I think in response to the larger battles query, that response, we're all involved in multiple battles at a given time, and some of us are more equipped for other battles than others. So there's no reason to suggest that we would be uniformly invested in the same battle, wait till that was solved, and then move on to the next battle. But in response to the broader question, Wakanda forever, right? No Black person got more free in the economic sense, in the political sense. Voting rights were not increased throughout the South because Black Panther came out, right? But measures of self-esteem in several emerging studies by colleagues in counseling psychology and developmental psychology found that watching Black Panther, seeing a world in which Black folks were not exclusively in subordinate roles, seeing a world in which they were represented with dignity, represented with morality, represented with wisdom, right, did have an impact on how children left the theater, how they understood superheroes, like how they understood an Afro future, right? When we think about Afrofuturistic literature and the work of Octavia Butler, James Baldwin, and in those traditions, right? So these things do matter. I find it very unlikely that There are a majority of teachers who are telling Black children that they or their families are undesirable. But we know that every time the doll study, in which a white doll and a Black doll are faced in front of a Black child, every time the doll study has been replicated, as recently, I think, as 2015, that the Black child is picking the white doll as evidence of worth, as the doll that's smart, as the doll that's patient, as the doll that's kind, right? So this is happening over and over again. There was the controversy related to the present conversation about Dr. Seuss books very recently. And we know that there are white children. The first images of African or African descended folks that they see were in a book about zoos where African-esque humanoid creatures were locked in cages. So we know that these images exist. And we know that removing them doesn't contribute to the broader emancipation struggle necessarily, but it does contribute to liberation and psychological wellness. And that is as important. That prepares you for meaningful citizenship, that prepares you to extend good faith when faced with difference, when faced with someone who disagrees with you. It prepares you to live a meaningful life where you can practice self-love, the love of your community, where you can have hope for what a radical multicultural democratic society might look like. So I believe that once, I don't know that, I don't know why I just gendered that. I totally know that when Black children are aware that their schools are named after individuals who enacted intentional or severe or intentional and severe harms on their communities, that it affects how they want to participate in schooling as a system. And not only how the schools are named, but who they see revered in textbooks, who has photos on the wall, who is disproportionately the subject of analysis and discussion, that it does affect how they understand themselves, positive racial identity, positive self-regard, and it affects their long-term investment in and fidelity to the democratic process that purportedly we all hold as central and valuable in the United States to what our tomorrows could look like.
Thank you. Does Professor Jones or Professor Epps, is there anything else you want to contribute to that?
Well, I just want to say really quickly, which I think is probably just a shallow version of what Professor Woodson has already told us. People disparage these particular concerns because they're purely symbolic. And people constantly are saying to me, you know, if it's a statue, it's just a statue, drive past it, don't look. We are human beings, and human beings live by symbols. Symbols are what give us our meaning. To the extent that we can perceive and understand and contextualize specific symbols, they provide us with the world that we believe we inhabit. And so it is obviously not the only thing that needs to happen in this country to move us toward justice, but I don't see how we can move toward justice if we're not willing constantly to evaluate the symbols that we're living by. So I'll just leave that there.
It's a real credit to our panelists that we still have over 100 people and it's past 6 o'clock and we're going to go till 6:30. So for those of you who want to eat while you're watching, feel free to do so because we know you're invading your dinner hour, but we want to keep going because of the interest that we have here. And I'm going to go right to the Q&A and ask the following question. Does symbolic purification have the effect of relieving us from guilt and having the difficult conversation about a historical figure's total contribution to society and our history? Wouldn't it be more thoughtful to maintain the name, or for that matter, even the statue, to ensure an ongoing focus and dialogue about that person's overall role in history, both positive and negative? Who wants to take that?
Well, I would just say that if you leave the name intact, if you leave the statue up, that is still a symbol of respect. We don't have statues, we don't name buildings after people whose values we don't share. You know, my students at Texas, sometimes I would say, they would say, oh, Jefferson Davis, he fought for what he thought was right. And I would say, well, so did Timothy McVeigh, when he bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995, but we would never erect a statue to him. I mean, how ridiculous is that? So I think that by leaving intact the name, the statue, the name of the building, it's, unless, there's a big plaque or there's a big sign that says, this is here for a new reason. We're paying attention to this person for a new reason so we can interrogate his background or whatever. I don't know. I think that's very problematic. Let me just say one thing too that I meant to say earlier, and that is often you'll hear people say, well, anybody should be judged according to their own times in history. So Thomas Jefferson was a man of his times. He wasn't, they weren't as enlightened as we are today. So why should we impose our values on people who lived in the past and made decisions that we know today were wrong? Well, I would argue against that. As early as the 1770s, a group of enslaved people in Boston were petitioning for their freedom because they understood what was at stake in the American Revolution. The Abolitionist Movement goes way back to the mid-18th century. These are all people, North and South, who understood that slavery was a great crime against humanity. Most of them didn't care, but they certainly understood the argument against slavery. So I think we do make a mistake in a historical sense if we just let a lot of people off the hook because they were the product of their times and assume they weren't aware of the tremendous debate that was going on really from the mid-18th century on about slavery and social justice.
Okay. Other thoughts?
So I get that one, that response a lot too. And it's a recommendation that as a teacher educator, as someone who trains social studies and history teachers and knows the limitations of that system, of that preparatory process, and knows the limitations of how social studies and history and political science education looks in classrooms. Who are these dialogue leaders? I think when 1619 came out, for all of the critiques of it, many of which I stand behind, but when the 1619 project came out, there were social studies teachers who were unaware why 1619 would be a relevant year to talk about in relationship to the forming of our country. I still explain Kwanzaa to individuals who are actively serving in leadership roles in predominantly Black schools. Again, whether the Black families might practice Kwanzaa or not, simply being aware of its existence and as a cultural phenomenon, having to explain. I mean, I took place in a conversation a few months ago where someone called MLK a rabble rouser and was refusing to integrate that content into their classroom. So I don't know who the dialogue leaders would be if we're to engage in continued meaningful dialogue. The reality is it hasn't happened to date. What resources are we going to draw upon to train the dialogue leaders, to find the dialogue leaders, to potentially compensate the dialogue leaders? Our teacher workforce is overwhelmed, underpaid. They're not going to participate in more professional development without significant and radical supports, particularly now in this historical moment. So I don't know who the dialogue leaders would be, and I don't know what platforms the dialogue would look like. Are we entrusting it to individual parents or individual school districts? If that were our desire, we're a pretty stubborn nation, and it would have manifested if that's what we wanted for our civic dreams and for our freedom dreams together. I don't see that happening. It's a recommendation that requires investment in radically new structures, curricular structures to what we already have.
Thank you. Professor Epps?
Well, I guess in this context, I have this case study in my head of the idea that we're somehow going to reach this synthesis where everybody's acknowledged, everybody wins a participation plaque, and therefore there's no, there's no problem with acknowledging or embracing some earlier people. And that is in my home in Virginia. Growing up, we had a holiday called Lee Jackson Day, where we celebrated, I think it was Robert E. Lee's birthday, but then they put Stonewall Jackson in there too. And it happened to be sort of 3 days before Martin Luther King's birthday. And when the movement came along for people saying we need to acknowledge Dr. King and his contribution and the role he played in liberating Virginia and the South and the nation, they got this great idea in Virginia that we would have Lee Jackson King Day. And for, I think, 3 or 4 years, that was the holiday. And it was one of these things that, like being at a party where someone makes a suggestion that is instantly, clearly wrong. Everybody learns something about. There's like this moment in the culture where people were like, Lee Jackson King Day. No, I can't tell you why that's not going to work, but it ain't going to work. So that's the problem with trying to do these kind of symbolic rebuses of jamming people together. At some point, you got to choose, and that's a tough moment. I mean, there's no way out of the choice. I think that is probably the message that I would send.
Let's go to Professor O for a question.
Yeah, this goes to a question raised in the audience, and it asked, let's see. That it asked, he liked Professor Epps, the fact that he brought up the idea that the sentimental feelings of one group of people, the majority, toward a monument are given higher priority than the feelings of the marginalized group feeling trauma. And I guess the question is, well, shouldn't it be the reverse, that you prioritize the feelings and experiences of the marginalized group rather than the majority group? So does it come down to perspective? Like in terms of making it, whatever the decision is, you have to choose a perspective, the majority perspective or the perspective of the marginalized. Professor Mari Matsuda says, when you have these decisions to make, you look to the bottom of the well. You look to the experience of the marginalized and oppressed for guidance about issues regarding justice. So if it comes down to it and you had to choose a perspective, is that the perspective you should go with? Anyone?
Oh,
Go ahead, Jackie.
well, I was looking at the chat questions too, and it relates to another one in the chat, which is the speakers keep talking about we. Who are we? And the implication in the question was, what if a majority of people, and it might be a large majority of people, don't want to change the name, don't want to get rid of the name John Marshall? Shouldn't that be a significant factor? And I would say that, that is one way to make a decision. It's always one way, right? Just to say, we're going to poll our alums, we're going to poll our students and our faculty, and we're just going to tally the numbers, yes or no, and we'll see who has the larger numbers. But I would say that's not a very reflective strategy. It's not a thoughtful strategy. It's not based on context or history. It's one way to go. It's one way to go, right? Just to say, we're just going to go with what the majority thinks about this and be done with it. I would just say that would be abdicating your own responsibility here to look at the question carefully, and you might decide to go the way the majority wants to go, but I'm not sure that's the only criterion that should be used here.
I guess I would just add, to go back to something I said earlier, which is, I think we, in the context of a law school, but in general, as a society, we need to be aware and sensitive to the degree to which legal structures are what frees society from making symbolic progress. To the extent that history and historical figures and historical symbols are sort of reified and made into property in one way or another. And then the idea becomes, well, you're out there and you're, threatened by this, or you're bothered by it. But you have nothing really to say about it within the legal dialogue because you have no ownership interest. And I found that litigation over the Lee statue in Richmond to be profoundly disheartening, just to cause me to question my own vocation in the law. It just seemed to me that we were not deliberately, but just systematically alienating really important ideas from their context and then turning them over to other people. The same thing happened in North Carolina with the Silent Sam Statute, which, as we know, now was put up to basically commemorate a scene on which brutal acts were carried out against African-American people and so forth. And the university attempted to, fortunately they were prevented, they attempted to pay a Confederate veterans group millions of dollars to compensate them for the supposed injury they incurred by not having Silent Sam brooding over the quad anymore. The law very rarely sides with the marginalized. I don't know how to deal with that, but I think in this context, we need to be really aware that to the extent that these things become legal disputes, we're not playing on a level playing field.
Professor Woodson, can you also chime in there? Because I actually wrote down something you guys said earlier where you said that we need to err on the side of the oppressed. So rather than looking at it in the sense of the majority and the minority, you specifically used the word of the oppressed because we have never done so before in the past. Can you expand upon that notion?
Oh, I sure can. So I use we to refer to those of us who are empowered by the possibility of democracy, right? So that doesn't mean we're going to agree all of the time. It doesn't mean that every outcome will be something that we're able to reach a clean consensus on, but hopefully that the principles, interpretive debates notwithstanding, would be things that we can agree upon, which if someone is harmed to the point where they can't perform their civic duties, if someone is kept from literacy, if someone is kept from meaningful participation in the economy in ways that they can't perform their civic duties, then we would all be concerned about that. So I suppose that if that is not you, then I should not say we. I'm using the royal we in that sense, but that's what I mean when I say we. And when I say we should err on the side of the oppressed, I have yet to study a movement, well, I should say a mainstream movement in Black history specifically, that did not petition for recognition using the framing that the founding fathers used, right? Like the perspective of the oppressed did not develop in a dark vacuum of oppression where folks did not have access to the ideas or writings or notions of freedom that the founding fathers shared with one another, or that the government articulated and re-articulated in different historical moments over time. There is an impulse toward wellness. There's an impulse toward life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that undergirds the writings of almost all people who have talked about the United States as an aspirational home or as a place of possible belonging. So erring on the side of the oppressed does not mean that we're erasing or eradicating those earlier ideas. It means that we're interpreting them in new contexts. It means that we're asking woman, what does suffrage mean and what could it mean? It means Black boy, what does safety mean? What does policing mean based on your experiences, based on your needs, based on the ways that you've been given access to these symbols and structures or not? So erring on the side of the oppressed is not, it is not vindicationism. It is not revenge. It is not an inversion of whiteness for Blackness or redness or yellowness or whatever the case might be. It is true attention to the ideals that have been articulated for those of us who live here, for those of us who belong here or desire to belong here, and working to articulate that in a way that is radically inclusive of those who have been excluded in the past.
We're down now to the final 10 minutes of our panel discussion. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking the final question. And that is that, with all due respect to the references that we've had this evening to Confederate monuments, I think it's fair to say that many of us on this call would say it's a big difference between Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and John Marshall, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. In other words, the decision is much more difficult because these men were builders of a nation. In the case of John Marshall, even those who believe strongly that we should change our name acknowledge that he was probably the greatest Chief Justice in our history and built much of our constitutional law. So my question tonight is, what can you give us as some guidance as we struggle with what for many people is a difficult decision? For some people, by the way, it's an easy decision, but for many, it's still a difficult decision. And the final thing I'll say to you is there are some who believe that we should not change our name, but we should hold a conference every year to talk about both the good things that John Marshall did and the bad things. There are also people who believe we should change the name and still hold the conference and talk about the good and the bad. So give us your wisdom in the final 10 minutes of our session tonight about how we grapple with this issue, particularly with somebody who is in the ilk of John Marshall, Thomas Jefferson, or George Washington.
Well, I can conclude by reiterating what I said at the beginning. I certainly am not going to weigh in on one side or another, but I'm going to urge you to have a deliberative and thoughtful process, involve as many people as possible, look at the history, look into John Marshall's life, look into his role as a slaveholder and other aspects of his life. But it's a complicated, difficult process. It has to be done thoughtfully, and I think it's exciting. I think just the process should be exciting. It is a way to confront history. And but the decision is not up to me. I'm not going to advise you one way or another. I think we've talked about a wide range of issues here this afternoon, including looking at the totality of someone's life and why they might be honored today, why they were honored in the past. But I'm not going to tell you what to do. So that's, those are my words, final words.
Who wants to go next?
I think, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Ashley, after you.
Professor Woodson, and then Professor Epps will end with you. Professor Woodson, go ahead.
All right, I think naming the invisible constraints or the constraints that everyone might not be aware of. Sometimes there are endowment considerations attached to this. Sometimes there's credibility issues attached with this. When I started telling friends that I was going to have this conversation, they said, well, just change it to Thurgood Marshall and you don't really have to change anything, right? I'm not going to advocate for or against that position, but it's definitely something that I heard. I think that my daughter just turned 18, so we're having conversations about the potential of tattoos, right? I still pay for everything, so it's entirely up to me. But we're having that conversation, and just a reminder that what you put on your body now will be on your body later. So who do you serve? What kind of relationships do you want to build? How do you want to be regarded in a decade and in 15 years and in 20 years? And what will the relevance of the decisions that you make right now be and mean? Whether that is some form of material atonement that could be paired with changing the name or not changing the name, whether it's institutionalized, continued dialogue like the conference, changing the name or not changing the name. What is your service to the community? What are you pairing with your decision to make the Marshall College a place that is representative of the best of your ideals and what you hope to contribute to society?
Thank you. Professor Up?
Well, I think there's a lot to gnaw on in this idea of, pursuing knowledge about this figure rather than making them just the eponym of the law school. And it's a wonderful idea. I do think that kind of thing is hard to do. And what's much more common in my experience is that to the extent the figure is recognized as great in the names and in the monuments and in the statues, that greatness is used to silence the discussion of the context. And, I grew up, I swear to God, if I had a nickel for every time I heard someone say, well, Mr. Jefferson deplored slavery. He really thought it was a terrible thing, because we didn't want to talk about the fact that this man lived on and fathered children with and everything, his human property. And the same problem, I think, potentially haunts a discussion of John Marshall. I mean, we are all familiar with Professor Finkelman's work now, where he demonstrated that the official narrative of Marshall as this figure only peripherally involved in slavery is utterly false. But that's been met with a lot of resistance because Marshall was great. So I don't know. I think maybe we have to be careful not to start with the greatness. Maybe we can get to the greatness later after we assess. How you do that, I don't know. And I'm going to stop talking now so that no one will ask me.
Before we conclude for the evening, some of you have asked in the Q&A, what's the next step in the process here at Cleveland Marshall? So let me explain what happens next. This is the first of several forums we're going to have, and we're in the process of planning at least 2 more. We hope both of them will be in April. If not, they may go into May. The next one will focus on institutions that actually have gone through this process. And what did they decide? Or in some cases, we may have people who are actually going through the process as we speak. Then there'll be a forum about the legacy of Chief Justice Marshall particularly. And one of the panelists will be Paul Finkelman, who Garrett Epps just referred to, who wrote a very noted book that probably exposed more than had ever been before to the extent that Chief Justice Marshall owned slaves. After that, assuming we don't do any more forums, we then move into the survey phase. Getting back to Professor Jacqueline Jones, she's indicated we need to get wide input, and that's where all of you come in. We will do some sort of survey process starting in either probably May or June, where we'll try to get your opinions. We'll then synthesize all that, and eventually it'll come back, I will tell you, to our faculty, but also the ultimate decision will be the universities. And I'm expecting that this process will conclude sometime either over the summer or the early fall. That's my best guess at this time, but I promise to keep you updated because it all depends on how quickly we can put together these forms and then get the survey instrument out and then get all of the responses back. I want to thank our phenomenal panelists. I want to thank Professor Reggie O and Terry Billups for helping me moderate tonight, but especially I want to thank Professor Jacqueline Jones, Professor Ashley Woodson, and Professor Garrett Epps. You are very gracious and generous in giving us so much of your time tonight. I've written 3 pages of notes when I wasn't talking. So we have a lot to digest based upon your wisdom tonight. And we hope to be able to keep in touch with you and let you know as we go through this process, there may be other times we ask you questions. And thank you to all of you tuning tonight. Stay tuned for another forum sometime in the month of April. Have a great evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.